Good evening, viewers. The coronavirus scare has once again hit India. In the first round, we had about 3 cases that emerged from Kerala, and largely everything was contained to that one state. There were travel restrictions that were imposed, warnings that were issued, preparations that were made. And then weeks later, again now, as more and more countries begin to find cases of coronavirus infection, so has India. We now have 6 cases, 3 new cases. That's essentially the concern, the 3 new cases that have emerged. Both the government says they have stepped up the efforts to contain the virus. On Mirror Now, we've been getting you the latest updates on the efforts being taken by the centre and the state governments to fight coronavirus. On what you should also be doing, we've been repeatedly telling you, and we'll do that once again later tonight. But for now, here at 8 p.m., I would actually like to start a conversation about the impact of a worldwide outbreak of coronavirus and how it's intensifying on the global economy, more specifically on our economy. And why I raise this issue now is because already, as you know, our economy is not in a great shape. Already, all of the indicators show that the pain is continuing. We have been asking this question, when will we see a turnaround? Now, with a fresh element in place, does it mean that all of 2020 is going to be gloomy for us? That forget appraisals, we should now start getting concerned about job losses and keeping your jobs safely? There are fresh indicators that I want to put across to you. These indicators, and these are the aspects that we will discuss this evening. Of course, the first one is how the growth forecast is now being revised, factoring in an impact of coronavirus. Now, many experts will probably say this is too early, and I agree with them. We don't know what the full extent will be. But suffice to say that the GDP growth is estimated to be at 5.1% for year 2020. This is the OECD report that's just come out. And they, in fact, have gone ahead to say that if coronavirus impact intensifies across the world, if it becomes more serious than what it is, it could wipe off half the growth that's anticipated for the world just this year. India will not be insulated from that. Of course, unemployment has again begun to go up. We saw it go to a 4-month high again. The unemployment rate for the month of February was 7.78% as per the CMIE data. Otherwise, our Q3 estimates for growth came just late last week, and they stood at 4.7%, so 4.5 to 4.7% is what we are looking at right now. It's the lowest we've seen in 27 quarters. Wholesale inflation and retail inflation, various aspects of the prices around you of various commodities and services and products that you use are also inching up. Like wholesale inflation has hit an 8-month high for the month of January at 3.1%. And the last data that we have from the Reserve Bank of India on consumer sentiment, and we've addressed this earlier as well, is at a 5-year low. So let's try and understand, where do we go from here? And I say this because the coronavirus impact on the world is expected to bring about a bigger slump. A 2% slump in global growth between January and March is the estimate according to a Goldman Sachs report that's just come out. China's production, imports and overall economy has obviously taken a bad hit. China's manufacturing has taken a hit, which impacts all of us. China is a global exporter. From United States to India, we are heavily dependent on things that we import from China. We don't even realize how much we actually bring in from that country. What does this mean for us? That's the big question. The statistics will continue to flash on your screens. Let me just point out, though, one might say, well, Indians don't seem to be so worried because the markets rebound. That could also be because the Reserve Bank of India and government together came out and said, we are in control of things so far, we are monitoring everything carefully. But what needs to be done is the big question. Let me first up go across to Dr. Arvind Virmani, former Chief Economic Advisor and Chairman for the Foundation of Economic Growth and Welfare. Good evening, Dr. Virmani. The basic question, when you have had conversations about the state of our economy, does it mean that our growth revival period gets longer, that it will take us now more time to get back on the growth track because of what coronavirus is doing to the world?
See, the coronavirus is actually a very complicated thing. So let me first just address that before coming to the overall Indian economy, which, as you correctly point out, is somewhere has been down roughly 30% from the average levels which we have seen in the last 7 years. So let me leave that for a minute because everybody is interested in the coronavirus. Now, basically, if we compare globally the coronavirus versus the global financial crisis in 2008, there's one big difference. But let me start with the similarities. The similarity is the drop in global demand, which will cut down the GDP growth estimates, and the effect of that on exports of every country and also on commodity prices. Now, most countries are more severely affected by the demand decline, but by and large, we know from our history that India actually benefits quite a lot from the fall in oil prices. And generally, our historical experience is that we come out more or less even from the decline in export growth and the decline in imports because of oil prices. So that part of it is not that worrying for us. But the coronavirus has an extra effect, which is to take out supply. And of course, we have discussed this, you've been discussing it, that particularly in China, there is a huge decline in the availability of labor. So one of the key questions, and the result of that is that both its consumer exports and its commodity exports will go down. And here, the intermediate goods which go into the production of other goods is more important for us. The globe may be affected a lot more by the decline in the consumer imports and consumer inflation, etc., countries like the US. But again, if we see our own position, we will be most likely affected by intermediate goods. One of these has been discussed before, the APIs, which go into the production of drugs. So for us, the intermediate good part is more important, and that will depend on how long it takes for the Chinese economy to recover. If the recovery happens in the calendar year second or third quarter, I think the effect, well, if it happens by second quarter, we'll be affected somewhat less. But if it goes on into Q3 and Q4, yes, we should start to get quite worried about it.
Dr. Virmani, you know, for a layman today, if you sit and read reports from across the world, you know, you're looking at companies in America telling people to work from home, to not even get out of their homes and interact with other people. You're looking at them cutting down as the aviation sector and the airline sector begins to curtail their flights. They are curtailing, obviously, the employment of people. So there is a bigger reaction we are seeing, especially in the West. Now, can that have a ripple effect on the economy in Europe, right, where, you know, we were still recovering?
So it's important to understand that the countries which had more interaction with China, USA is the largest importer of goods from China. So there's a lot of movement of people which goes along with trade, investment, etc. So as far as I can summarize, what I am seeing is those countries which had a lot of interaction with China are being more severely affected by the coronavirus, and therefore there the risks and the dangers are much higher. Now, India, we have a large deficit with China, but you know, our interactions are relatively limited compared to the size of our economy. Partly it's because our whole export-import, our international trade is not that high, and the economy is not dependent on it. So you're quite right. There are many countries, because of their large interaction. Italy is one surprise. People didn't know how much interaction they had with China, but it seems that the luxury goods, which Italy is a big exporter of, were really being manufactured in China, and there was a lot more interaction. So it depends on the interaction. So those countries which have larger interaction certainly will be more severely affected.
And just a quick question before I let you go on otherwise the state of our economy and what has been done in the last 6 months. If we are beginning to actually see any effect of the steps that the government has taken.
Yeah, I think, well, there are two parts to it. One is, the issue initially was how far the economy would go down. I think, in economics, we call a trough. Now, trough doesn't mean it'll suddenly start booming, but I think, in my judgment, basically the economy has now bottomed out. Bottom out means it could be stuck at that bottom for a long time. And the question then it becomes how fast it will recover. I think it's going to be a U-shaped recovery, and as you have which means you could be close to the bottom for quite some time, for several quarters now, and the speed of the recovery really depends critically on how much the government, how much reforms the government does. And unfortunately, I don't think it has done enough to say for us to look forward to a quick recovery, let's say by next year or so. So the recovery could be prolonged and slow and stretched out over several years, if nothing else is done.
Over several years, slow and prolonged, says Dr. Virmani. Thank you so much. As always, pleasure to have you on our show with your views. I'm going to open this up for our panel right now and also say good evening to Gopal Agarwal, National Spokesperson for the BJP, Dr. Brinda Jagirdar, Senior Economist, and with me in our studios this evening, Dr. Ajay Dua, former Commerce Secretary. Dr. Dua, let's begin with you. And let's take off from the point that Dr. Virmani was making. Do you agree that not just this year, but perhaps it will take us longer than that to see some turnaround?
I didn't quite understand how he came to that appreciation. Right now, we are seeing some green shoots of recovery from the economy, from where we were in Q2 in particular. But with coronavirus now becoming an issue in India, particularly in the last 2 or 3 days, what we've seen. But more important than that, I would say the very fact that China sees 3 kinds of immediate developments which impact us. India wasn't immune from, already not immune from what was happening around the world, globally. Number one, the Chinese, several thousands of Chinese factories have closed down.
Yes.
Chinese government may or may not have said that. We have satellites showing that NOx emission.
Correct.
In not only
they have
Wuhan.
Cleaner air now.
Yes, that you have cleaner air and they are no longer emitting the NOx which they used to. That means manufacturing is down.
Yes.
Second, China probably, Tanvi, shipped out more stuff out of their ports than most Asian countries, I would say, than the Asian countries put together. I understand, on an average, China pushes out 7,15,000 containers a day from their ports. Those ports have also virtually come to a grinding halt. Third, tourism from China was a major factor in several countries of the world, and this is not just the neighboring countries, be it in Europe, elsewhere. It was the Chinese who were going there and keeping up the whether it was air travel, hotel industry, and all the kind of related activities. That's also cut down hugely. With these things happening, how could India, which is now a part of the supply chain, supply chains may not have necessarily originated in China, which impact us, some of them directly.
Yes.
But where China was an important link.
Yes.
So if those have got disrupted because of the 3 developments in China, which I mentioned over the last 5 weeks, certainly we have to feel the heat of it.
Right.
I understand as many as 50,000 Indian companies are impacted by the supply chain disruption.
Yes.
And some of them was very critical for us. For instance, we all talk about pharma,
Yeah.
where the APIs, particularly for our generic drugs, antibiotics included, for
Yes.
which we are both a very large consumer.
Yes.
You know, we consume far more antibiotics than we should be, and elsewhere the world is far more careful about it. Similarly, stuff like paracetamol, etc., for which we were known to be exporters. Those are going to be hit very
Yes.
shortly. Stocks are running out. Second, our exports of automobiles.
Absolutely.
And in that, I'm particularly talking about engine parts and electrical parts in cars. A lot of them are dependent upon the Chinese imports from China. And a third large export of ours, as well as consumption, is electronics.
Yes.
All kinds of electronic items, particularly the chips.
Yes.
Not just semiconductor, the chips,
Absolutely.
be it for our mobile telephones, for our appliance, white goods, all of them are today facing a crunch that let's be very careful about how liberal we are in using them,
Yes.
because we do not know whether replenishments after a few days will take place or not.
Absolutely. In
Having
fact,
said that,
yeah.
all that I'm just trying to say is we are certainly impacted, and I hope we do not also have this much greater incidence of the COVID-19 in India,
Absolutely.
because then the impact is going to
human
be
cost.
humongous. You are going to see not just the economic impact, the social impact and the impact on our manpower,
Absolutely.
etc., is also going to be very large.
Absolutely. In fact, which is why the three cases that have emerged are being taken so seriously by the authorities right now that, they're literally tracking every point where that person would have been, or the patient would have been in the last few days, from the restaurants where they've eaten, to the buses that they have traveled in, to even the school where the patient's children are going to. All of those are being shut down, cleaned up. People are being put in under scrutiny so that we contain this right now. And so the human cost remains a big concern. But Dr. Jagadhar, if I could come to you on what Dr. Ajay Dua was talking about. For example, if we take there are two aspects. One is our own consumption, the prices for our products, or the shortage in our market, whether it's medicine shortage, paracetamol or antibiotics, or even prices of electronics going up. That's one aspect, or spare parts of our cars becoming a problem. The other is our own industry getting into trouble because the parts are not coming from China. That's the other aspect, which probably is also a big concern, because then we don't know what the ripple effect will be. Already our manufacturers and our businesses are struggling. And if we add that, how do you see this panning out?
Tanvi, you're absolutely right. Remember, India is more linked into the global supply chain now, and we are also more closely connected with the global. We are far more open economy today than we were even 10 years ago. So anything that happens in the economy, global economy, is certainly bound to affect us. Remember, we were already in a synchronized slowdown, and that's what the IMF has said. So already the economy was slowing down, and all countries are facing this slowdown. And now we have the situation of the coronavirus, which has accelerated this process. So the global supply chain will definitely get disrupted. And because of that, India's manufacturing is certainly bound to take a hit, whether it's electronics, pharmaceuticals, fertilizers, consumer goods, and of course 5G also would I'm sure would get pushed back. So and tourism. So in every way we stand to get we are exposed really, and those are really difficult times. So well, I can't really call it a silver lining, but then the one positive aspect is the fall in oil prices. Oil touching about 50 or so now is definitely good for the Indian economy, our current account, our fiscal deficit, our inflation and growth. So that and of course overall commodity prices getting softened. But then really, because we are so dependent on the global supply chain, not only for imports, but even for exports. So we are a hub for manufacturing of certain items which we export abroad. And so that is definitely going to get affected. The only thing is that yes, some of the steps which had been put in place earlier, for example, now I understand Samsung has shifted all its production to India from China. Then we are also manufacturing wings for Lockheed 16 from India, which are also getting exported. Similarly, for automobiles, a lot of cars and auto parts are made in India for exports. So these are definitely going to get affected, and we cannot remain immune from what is happening in the global economy. So we definitely need to step up our vigil, whether it's in the economic front or the social front or the health front. We have to be very careful.
Yes, absolutely. And times are a lot more different, I believe, from when SARS actually spread and that outbreak took place and the impact we had on the world. Also, because this one is coming out from China, and China is such an important factor when it comes to the global trade. That perhaps the impact will be far more intense and serious. It now only depends on how much countries are able to lock down and keep a check on the travelers coming in and out, and how soon we are able to really tackle this virus. But Gopal Agarwal, what's the government's plan of action? For a few months you've been saying it's been the global factors that have been hitting our economy. Now there's genuinely a massive global factor that seems to be hitting our economy.
Tanvi, the point made by my previous panelist is right, that coronavirus will impact the global economy, and that way it will have a negative impact on the domestic economy also. But I would like to mention 2-3 points which can give some relaxation to the domestic industry. Is that India, we had a very big fiscal trade deficit with China, and everybody was talking that there is a large scale dumping of Chinese good into India, and that was harming our domestic industry. So they were talking about FTA, the domestic industry was talking about RCEP, which the government agreed. So, the dumping of cheap Chinese good will definitely be negatively impacted. I think this can be looked into a positive development for domestic industry to work on this time and work on the future course of action. Second thing is that we have a negative trade balance with China that was also impacting our trade deficit to a very big extent. And the third is, we were never part of global supply chain integrated with Chinese, except in the pharmaceutical industry, where API was being large scale API was imported from China and exported to in the form of generic medicine. But there also I had met several times with the pharma industry. They were saying that earlier majority of API was being manufactured in India, but because of Chinese influx of cheap API, our domestic industry got distracted and it was harmed. So we have again a chance to improve our API industry also. I think these are and there is an issue of oil price falling. That's also a positive effect. So there are certainly a negative impact of coronavirus. But I think it's a short-term impact. Ultimately,
when you say short-term, how short-term?
That it will has to pass off.
Yes, Mr. Agarwal, but we don't know yet.
3-4 months, I think it will not be. No, we don't know. I don't know. But ultimately, this kind of virus attack cannot prolong to a very large extent, but it will have impact. But I don't think India should be that much worried on the economic front.
Okay.
The issue of health, the other thing, prevention, that's are important thing. But I think with our competition from China, and our trade deficit, our not integration of global supply chain with the Chinese industries and cheap import, all these things, and lowering of the petroleum prices will definitely tide us over the crisis in a very short
Okay,
term.
Dr. Dua,
I
can that
think
happen?
Indian
Can we
economy
use this?
does not need to be
Certainly,
panicked.
Can we use this as an opportunity to
Tanvi,
lower
the
our dependency on
opportunity
China?
is the softening of the commodity
I think
prices.
Tanvi,
Yes.
just
Certainly,
10 seconds more.
accept
Tanvi,
that
10
point.
seconds.
That
Okay, I think I'll just give
Challenges
him 10
are,
seconds more. Yes.
yeah,
Yes, Gopal Agarwal.
challenges are always an opportunity if you can make use of them. Otherwise, they become a big challenge. So I think the government is well prepared to take it as this challenge as an opportunity. Industry should come forward.
Yes,
They
that's the
had been
point.
always
And you
talking
said it
about
yourself, Mr.
this
Gopal
Chinese
Agarwal.
onslaught.
Yeah, that's the point. You said it yourself. The government may have an intent, but it's the industry that needs to show that. It's the industry that
I
needs
was
to
coming
actually
exactly
respond.
to that.
Yes.
The fact of the matter is, you asked earlier about the SARS
Yes.
of 2002-3 and the COVID-19.
Yes.
Over these 17 years, Tanvi, China has become a force in the world.
Absolutely.
Chinese economy in this 17 years has tripled.
Yes.
Almost every 5 to 5.5 years,
Yes.
doubling up. At that particular point of time, just if I recall, the trade between China and India was a meager $4 billion. Today, that trade is $57 to $58 billion. So we have become, be it APIs because they could make it cheaper, be it solar panels or whatever. The fact is our relationship, trade relationship with China is now a significant one, even if there is a trade deficit against us.
Yes.
The second, the fact of the matter remains that you cannot fill up the gap which is getting, or space which is getting vacated because the Chinese have a problem. Because to capture the international market, you have to do whole lot of things. It is not, and we saw that when China-US trade war was at peak. Everybody said India can step in.
But we have not been able
We
to.
haven't been, because to get a foothold into the international market, you have to be taking action on a whole lot of fronts consistently, including in your macro parameters.
Right.
Third, I would say the industrial competitiveness,
Right.
which is the most important thing in the area of exports, doesn't come about overnight. That comes in through a whole lot of things, including attracting cheap capital. That means one factor of production. And when would that happen? When you start having mechanisms for enforcement of contracts.
Right.
If you keep on they're not honoring those,
Exactly.
nobody is going to put long-term money, which is cheaper than even if our banks were willing to lend.
Right.
And finally, I would say the industrial competitiveness also comes when there is scale, economies of scale. If demand keeps on shrinking in India, how would the industry be able to reduce its price?
Right.
So action on several fronts, and I would say that advantage to us, all right, $18 to $20 billion because of petrol bill coming down.
Right.
But that's a pittance, I would say, except that it helps your fiscal deficit in the overall size of the economy. This is not going to make too much of a difference.
Okay, yes. Mr. Gopal Agarwal wanted to make a point before I go to Dr. Jagirdar.
I would like to tell that this petroleum prices is one thing which can be used as a positive impact. One thing, our economy needed capital. That was one of the biggest problem. And in this budget also, Nirmala ji opened up our domestic bond market and even corporate bonds for sovereign funds, pension fund, insurance funds. And I think that flow will come to India because investment opportunities will attract those funds also. And the government is present also pushing up for large scale infrastructure expenditure, and that is also helped the industry, because you see NSO data told that government expenditure has increased in first and second quarter, and we had improved our estimated GDP growth in first and second quarter. So there is a positive sign on the economic growth. Government has come out with a very pro-business, pro-wealth creation budget, and it was prodding industry to come up for investment. So these are an opportunity for them to invest. The banking sector is also being pushed by the government to lend to finalize the project, and finally decide on the project financing, etc. So government is pushing for project financing to the bank. Government has come out with heavy expenditure on infrastructure.
Okay.
Government has opened bond market and the domestic corporate bond market for foreign investment. Infrastructure, 6,500 infrastructure project has been identified. So I think and oil prices come. So this
apart from oil prices coming down, Mr. Gopal Agarwal, everything else is still on paper.
No, I am telling
is not showing us an impact on ground. Maybe it will in 6 months, maybe it will in 3 months, or at least a year. We don't know. I'm just saying, while the economy is still this fragile and we're taking all of these steps, Dr. Jagirdar, what I think is extremely concerning is for example, this report by OECD, which says that if the situation from here worsens at a global level for coronavirus, half the growth expected for the world this year can be wiped off. If the world is expected to grow at 2.9%, it will probably just grow at 1.5%. Now, what kind of impact will that have on us?
Certainly, that's a very worrying aspect. And it's not just China, it's the entire East Asia which has been impacted very significantly, because their economies are so closely linked with China. Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, or Thailand, all these economies, Indonesia, Malaysia, all these economies, they are so closely linked with China and the Chinese supply chain, which goes into the global supply chain. So that will definitely get impacted immediately in the first round. And if the entire economy, if the entire global economy is going to slow down, then certainly it will affect not only our imports, but also our exports, because it will be difficult for us to really find markets when these markets are shrinking. And already global trade is growing at single digits now, which should be much higher. So global trade has been shrinking for a while, and it will shrink even sharply now if the impact of the coronavirus becomes more vicious.
Yes.
So we are definitely in very difficult times, very uncertain times, and so it's difficult to predict and say when is the turnaround going to come, what is going to happen. But yes, there are some opportunities, and let's try to put our own house in order before that, because yes, our manufacturing, let's improve our competitiveness, let's look more inward. And more importantly, I think it's very important to have enforcement of contracts. If we don't have a system where there is no continuity of contracts, no sanctity of contracts, and no continuity of policy, then it will be very difficult to attract investment even after the economy recovers. So we need to use this time to really put our house in order, and change some long-term policies which will really strengthen the economy.
Well, I'm going to hold on to that positive thought that both of our experts brought in, that perhaps we can use this time to bring our house in order. Perhaps we could get in better policies, clean up the current system which is there, which is just adding and slowing down our growth engine any which ways, and really hope for the best. A lot of the factors are not under our control, but obviously it's not good news. It's not good news for you and me, that apart from the fact that our economy was already struggling and we were hoping that there would be a turnaround sometime soon, there is now this big factor that the world is grappling with, and we honestly don't know for how long this will continue and what could be the extent of its impact. I'm going to take a very short break. On the other side, we've got Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia joining us with his views on the current status of economy. Stay with us. Welcome back. Tonight, the spotlight is on the state of economy. We've got you 5 different indicators, one of course being various reports that have emerged about the possible impact of coronavirus on our economy. On top of that, what was already plaguing our economy and the indicators that showed that state, from unemployment still being a big concern, to retail and wholesale inflation now becoming a huge concern, to the slowdown in the economy and the turnaround not really being visible, and repeated revisions in our growth forecast becoming a concern. The indicators are far too many. The consumer sentiment is yet to show us a rebound. People are still not buying, manufacturing companies are still struggling, and private companies are still not investing. Add to that, now this global sentiment and this global scare about coronavirus. It has to be taken extremely seriously because China is a very important component of world trade. And when China begins to shut down, then it impacts several countries, from the United States to Italy and Spain in Europe and back home in the Middle East. Everywhere we are seeing repercussions. What does it mean for our own growth revival? We were hoping that in the next 6 months, India will begin to run at a faster pace yet again. Is that not going to happen? Is this gloom and doom going to continue for longer? Let's ask Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, ex-Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, joining us this evening. Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, thank you so much for being with us here on Mirror Now. Just for the understanding of our viewers, are we to now prepare ourselves for a longer haul, that the gloom and doom will probably continue through 2020?
Well, let me say that we had slowed down even before the coronavirus hit us. So actually, we were not growing rapidly. We were actually slowing down very significantly. And it was also felt that the reasons for the slowdown are not just cyclical. So it was not going to quickly reverse itself. Now, what has happened since then is that the coronavirus has introduced a huge amount of uncertainty with a downward bias, if you like, in the world economy, which is only negative. So we don't have any good news on that front. We were confronted even in the beginning with not very good news, so the challenge is that much greater.
Let's begin with coronavirus for a bit, and then I will come to the rest of the Indian economy and what was already happening. In United States now, they're completely shutting down travel to many countries. The companies have asked people in a few cases to work from home. There are lots of precautions being taken. Obviously, with all the Chinese ports shut, nothing is getting out of that country. So even in our own, for our own economy and manufacturing, parts are not coming in. Components and ingredients and products are not coming in. And that's become a big concern. Europe itself is now looking at a bigger concern, with Italy and Spain getting more patients. I'm just trying to understand, Dr. Ahluwalia, that what does this mean for world trade? And in that scenario, what does it mean for India that does have a huge amount of trade with China?
No, it's clearly negative for world trade. Look, any disruption of world connectivity and world trade is negative for the world economy. It's negative for the economies that are most connected with the economies that are affected. And as you say, we have substantial reliance on China for certain kinds of imports. Of course, in the longer run, we can diversify, but in the short run, the next 6 months or so, that is not going to be very easy. So we must assume that whatever we thought was the earlier likely growth rate, which, as I've said, wasn't very high, can only be lowered a little bit because of the coronavirus. I mean, I've seen global estimates of lowering of the growth rate by something between 0.1 and 0.2%. Now, for different countries, it could be more or less than that, but nobody is benefited by this. This is definitely going to be negative for everyone. And that's quite apart. That's quite apart from the burden that we will face in handling the coronavirus threat ourselves.
Yes.
Because it's not a small, it's not a minor thing. And if the WHO actually declares it a pandemic,
yes,
many people would say that we would have to spend a lot of resources in trying to get this under control.
Yes, and that's an additional cost, a human cost, as well as what we will have to spend on then tackling that pandemic. From 8% to 4.5% to 4.7%, that was our growth trajectory effectively, Dr. Ahluwalia, in less than a year, from January last year to just the third quarter of FY20. That's how quickly our growth has fallen. Should I then ask a question now that with an added burden
that's
of
not because of
coronavirus?
let me explain just 1 second. That decline is not due to the coronavirus.
Absolutely not.
That
I'm just
decline
asking
has
you.
been taking place over the last 2 or 3 years.
Yes. Yes. I'm just asking you, with the added burden now of coronavirus and how that may impact the global economy, could we possibly be looking at a recession? Is that a possibility now? We were simply talking about a very serious slowdown. Could it be a recession for our country?
I don't know what you mean by a recession, in the sense, do you mean negative growth? Because that's what very often people mean by a recession. I don't think we'll actually get negative growth, but the recovery from the 4.5% will be much more difficult than was thought earlier. I mean, it was difficult even earlier, but this will only make it more difficult.
What can the government do?
Well, that's tough. I mean, most of the things that the government needed to do in order to get out of the slow growth remain valid even today. Because, you know, if you think the underlying growth potential was around 7.5%, and the growth was brought down to 4.5%, a lot of that had to do with taking care of the structural problems that had arisen. This slowdown was not just cyclical, it was structural. Now, many people have talked about, you know, the two critical areas where we need to do better. I mean, one is the revival of private investment, because private investment fell very sharply, and that led to a loss of demand in the economy, which actually led to a loss of production. Now, people have also talked about reviving consumption. But, you know, when income goes down, consumption goes down, and if people fear that income is going to go down further, until the signal to the consumers is that the fears on income are not valid, they are not likely to raise their level of consumption. So really, much the best thing to do is to focus on the revival of investment. Now, there are many things that the government needs to do to bring that about. One of them, I think, is taking care of the problems faced by the banking system and the non-bank finance companies. You know, rapid growth cannot take place if credit expansion is not taking place. And for a variety of reasons, I mean, bank lending has actually sputtered. So that's one area that the government needs to address. It has said it's trying to address it, and we have to see how well they can do that. You know, the other big issue really is exports. And of course, with the uncertainty introduced by the coronavirus on global trade, in the short run, it won't be very easy to expand exports. But we should assume that somehow the coronavirus problem will come under control, and look at the 2 to 3 year horizon, what we need to do. And I think on exports, there are many things we need to do. One of the things we need to do is not to raise our customs duties. I think one of the steps that the government has taken in this budget and also in the previous budget is to reverse a long-standing policy that we must reduce the level of customs duties to increase the level of competitiveness in the economy. I know that there are different views on this. I mean, many people think that raising customs duties will give a boost to manufacturing. I mean, it'll give a boost to the sector that you protect, but it will actually make the economy as a whole much less competitive. So I personally do not think that was the right thing to do. Looking further ahead, if you're thinking of integrating with the world economy, I personally think it would be a good idea to join the regional cooperation, the RCEP agreement in East Asia. I mean, we negotiated it over a long period. I think it sends a wrong signal not to join. I don't know what I know that there were many pressures, and of course, on the political side, there have been people saying that we shouldn't join, but this is something that you need to look at the long-term interests of the country.
Okay.
And I think that's another area where a forward movement could happen. I feel that a very visible signal of addressing specific problems that are holding back the private sector and causing uncertainty would also help. Now, for example, take the telecom sector. I mean, it's a phenomenally important sector. For a long time, it's been subjected to all kinds of, there have been disputes going on about what is the liability that corporates have because of the definition of adjusted gross revenues. A very recent decision of the Supreme Court seems to have interpreted the definition of adjusted gross revenues in a manner which will impose huge liabilities, not just on the two private sector telecom companies, but also on Oil India and GAIL that are engaged in some of this activity.
Yes.
And if you apply that to their total revenues, I mean, they're completely broke.
Right.
Now, if this is simply left to the legal system, I don't think we'll get a solution. I think this is a typical case where the government perhaps needs to intervene and take steps that will actually be seen as
Dr. Ahluwalia, I think actually the government was probably trying to work out something, but before they could do that, they got pulled up and they got wrapped by the Supreme Court for not implementing their orders, as per the specific instructions that were given. But yes, telecom and the fate of telecom companies does continue to be a huge concern. I'm afraid we've run out of time. It was a pleasure to have you. Wish we could have you again soon as we continue to put the spotlight on the Indian economy and the state of affairs. And as we wrap up this conversation, I just want to point out that the US Central Bank, viewers, has actually, in an emergency and surprising move, cut the interest rates by 50 basis points. And you will see a lot more of these steps being taken by various countries, their governments and their central banks as they tackle coronavirus impact and try and protect their own economies from a larger impact due to this outbreak of coronavirus. We'll also wait and watch to see what the government back home and the Reserve Bank of India does to ensure that our economy is as insulated as we can actually possibly do. Dr. Ahluwalia, thank you for joining us. I'm going to take a